thrilled to talk data commons and data commoning and data trusts with Peter Wells and Anouk Ruhak. Peter, just take it away.
Cool. I just check? Can people see the slides on their screens?
Yes, I can.
Good for me.
Excellent.
There we go.
Cool.
Thumbs up from Anouk. Excellent.
So I'm going to try and keep on time. I can talk fast. I can also sometimes talk very quietly. So do let me know if you can't hear me by waving at the screen, etc. I also get nervous, which means I make bad jokes and extemporize. This is just my out.
Right, we love bad jokes.
Okay. As long as the jokes. Cool. So I'm Peter Wells. For those who don't know me, I've got my background is actually 20 years in the private sector, building and consulting on technology and telecoms across Europe. I accidentally moved into policy. In 2014, I took a midlife career break and emailed the Labour Party and said, "You're doing digital government policy, want any help?" And after a couple of conversations, they said, "Cool, in charge of digital government policy for a bit, do an independent review." I then ended up working for the ODI for 4 years, doing data policy with them. And I'm all about making data and technology work for people. So I've got lots of possibility, but I want to see them working for people. When I'm talking about data, or increasingly actually, I want to try to define what we mean by data, or more specifically, what I mean by data. You may use a different term, and just understanding where I come from might help you understand and translate into your own mental models. Recently, the UK government framework for a national data strategy, a catchy name for a catchy document, had a very long section trying to define what it meant by data, which you can kind of summarize as data is information on a computer. Now, I'm going to work with that and say it's stuff on a computer. I don't want to particularly get drawn into what information is and the difference between data, information, knowledge, etc. But I'm talking about stuff on a computer in the rest of this talk. Now, one interesting point there is to think of when people talk about data protection normally around both digitized data on a computer and information which is on paper. You get these different overlaps of what the words mean and what they've been used for, which can be interesting in many cases. Now, also just want to start off with a bit of, I imagine for this audience this isn't needed, but it's useful when I use this deck for other purposes. A bit of non-comprehensive history about resources and the commons. So commoning has radical political roots. So that's the diggers. I know this land has made a common treasury for everyone to share. So that was people who did not have enough resources, enough freedom, enough control over their lives to live the way they wanted to. So they started taking land back and working for themselves until many of them were killed and the rebellion was put down in the 16th century. That's all part of centuries of protest from people over those two resources. A picture of the Rebecca riots. The Rebecca riots are one of my most favourite things. The Rebeccas were a group of Welsh citizens who were finding it in Wales in the 18th century. Pretty much all the roads around Wales were toll roads. So people, and it cost a lot of money to get around, to go to the market, to see your friends, see your family. So people dressed up as women. Everyone called themselves Rebecca and went and burned things down. It's almost like an early version of Anonymous, according to one book I was reading about them in. But it's like wonderful protest for access to resources and people saying we need to do something. And eventually then government did step in, change the rules and make the roads free to travel. We've also got centuries of businesses governing access to resources. That is the New River, the start of the New River outside London. When London was growing in the 17th century, they were fresh water. So a business built to take new water into London, which they will sell off to people in London. And it's called the New River. It is still there. Obviously, a couple of centuries later, government stepped in and started regulating that resource to say, okay, you've had your profit, you met that immediate need. We now need to step in to do more governance around this and to make sure water is available to everyone. It's at a fair price. And that was the start of lots of the fresh water acts all around the world. So when you look at it, we then have, particularly around commons, we have Elinor Ostrom. So from all these centuries of organising protests of businesses, of governments, and communities doing things, Elinor Ostrom looked in and said, what are some of the common principles? What are some of the common methodologies that are being used for collective action around common pool resources and governance? Obviously, after that, despite that and despite that work, we still have lots of problems, as anybody in Flint, Michigan, for example, in a well-developed country will talk about, with their access to water. And we still have people creating new resources. So the internet, the web, computers have created lots of new resources, and we can conceptually put data into that pool alongside bits and pieces. That's kind of where we are. So just want to say, there's been centuries of work there. This isn't new. We have been through these cycles before, but it takes a while to get through them, and often the continue to get struggles over governance and who looks at it well. Now, at the moment, we've got a lot of data things happening in the EU and the UK. We have a European data strategy, which is a grand document tied into the EU, which is, its purpose is quite confusing though. So we start to look at this through some of the lens of, like Elinor Ostrom's principle, data strategy. Even on the front page, it says its purpose is to be a global role model to benefit businesses, researchers, and public administrations, not citizens, but to empower individuals, businesses, and organizations to make decisions. It's got these conflicting purposes going on in there. And it's the whole of the EU, all sectors, single market for data or information on a computer, which is quite an enormously large scale. Within the EU data strategy, there's the concept of data spaces, which are more of a concept than a thing. It's quite hard to pin down what people mean by a data space. Some of the bits in there, when you look at them, they're technical. Some bits are around legal governance, some bits are institutions, some bits are standards. But the idea is there'll be 9 sectoral data spaces, and a lot of the work to define data spaces is being done by some very large businesses as part of the Big Data Value Association, which is a catchy name or catchy organization. And you get there, you start to see there as well a bit of a potential tension. So if you have a data space for healthcare, which is one of the ideas, how does that, which is part of the data strategy and the digital strategy, how does that relate to the healthcare strategy, which is a different part of the EU, or the healthcare strategy in a particular country or particular region? And within those data spaces, you'll see them saying they're going to build their data commons for better government services. Is in there, is that what's going to happen? It's quite hard to tell, but you can see those concepts and the language and the framing going into those places. As I say, it's some very senior discussions of some very serious people. France. So just a few weeks ago, the French digital diplomacy team, which is, if you don't know, France has set up a digital diplomacy department as part of its foreign office for interacting with digital initiatives. It's run by Henri Vellier, who helped set up EtaLab and all those things. And I think I've pronounced his name correctly before anyone tells me off French. I've met him, he's a very nice man. I do like Henri. That talks, and this is a blog post on their site by somebody else, which talks about, again, it channels classic enclosure versus commons thinking. When you start to look at the purpose, it's saying this is a strategic potential for Europe. It's about giving a place for Europe within a digital world dominated by private monopolistic players and driven by the rivalry between China and the US. Is that what a commons is about? It talks about it being a digital commons, broadens out the conversation beyond data to include software, computers, and some of the services around them. Starts to look at those things. But it's very little in there about the EU's strengths. It's mostly about combating other people, which is a curious little thing that's going on in there. Then you also find, if you look to the EU and some legislation is coming out in a couple of weeks' time, I think it's going to get published in draft. The EU is looking at legislating for data intermediaries like data cooperatives, like personal data stores. There are lots of these ideas which are, I suppose, struggle to some extent to get traction. It's trying to create space for them, also trying to govern them to make sure they can only be used for certain purposes. There's just press reports about it now, because they're else in the public domain. Now, when I go down further down the EU, you can see particularly Barcelona is often talked about in the commons space. So Barcelona has been spending a lot of time trying to build using the language of a data common for what they're doing. They're trying to do it to empower the citizens of Barcelona. So for them, it's about empowering people and achieving improvements to the public service in Barcelona. It's very much part of the economy of the political philosophy in Barcelona. So it's been it was until Francesca left, and a very close relationship between Ada Colau and Francesca Bria to bring these things together and start to build it. That one is interesting as well. It also brings in the language of data infrastructure, which is something I used to work on quite a lot in my ODI days. That's again a different framing for data, slightly different to a resource thinking of this infrastructure. If I look to the UK, which I have to do because I live here, and I love the UK, even though occasionally I get very, very worried about living here in certain times. No disrespect to anybody on the call who thinks differently. The UK's recently launched a national data strategy, or framework for national data strategy, which is its purpose is to unlock the value of data, is where it's mostly focused on. So it's conceptualizing the values within the data, using that to drive growth within the digital section across the economy. I think of growth within the digital sector, the most successful economic growth there is advertising firms like Facebook or Google and those things. That's where a lot of the growth has been. So you can put that in there. The national data strategy covers all types of data, from defence, security, and healthcare. Again, it's got a very large scope as to the decisions being made in the national data strategy that affect other things. So when I'm thinking about governance and the commons, I start to think about where that power is shifting. The immigration will be in the national data strategy. Thinking of data as a tool for use in immigration is quite a fascinating thing as Brexit is going through. In the UK, we also have people thinking about data commons at a think tank level. So there's a paper there from PPR, who are a left-wing think tank within the UK. So that's a paper I reviewed for the author, James Meadway. So he was thinking of a commons in there as, I suppose, closer to what many of us might think of Mallow Ostrom, of how to use commons thinking to control to local places, with national government playing a coordinating and stewardship role, but looking for democratic and innovative work at community, local and regional levels, trying to shift those things around. The Lovelace Institute, who again, a declaration of interest, an organisation I do some work with every now and again. The Ada Lovelace Institute are an independent think tank, and they've got a mission to share the benefits of data and AI just equitably. Now, they've been running a series around data commons, both assessing the existing things they can see in Ellen Rostrom's principles of good stewardship, which is an interesting thing. There's a link on this which will have to be sent on. The also running a blog post on there by Doug Hoyle and Nick Cox, which I found a bit more challenging, because that was using the commons thinking, but was back to that kind of how do we unlock value in data? Rather do we govern it to give people the control over it, decide what value we want to run, if any. And then we have other organisations like Nesta, who are looking about data institutions. So they've come up with some kind of think about data governance along seas of value and control, and recommending different approaches that can be used based on there. Or the ODI raised where doing work on data institutions where it's how data can help tackle big global challenges, but the institutions aren't necessarily limited to those global challenges. So it's more organisations whose purpose involves stewarding data on behalf of others towards public, educational, or charitable aims. And then globally, we also have other organisations, whether that be Mozilla Data Futures, and I'm not sure if Anouk is part of the Data Futures Lab or how well connected these things are together, but the Mozilla Futures Lab recently did some research looking at various models through the lens of shifting power, and saying, are these models shifting power? How are they working? What kind of power shifts would they work? And then you have the group at Stanford around the Digital Society Lab. These are people like Lucy Bernholtz and her team who are looking at building new forms of digital infrastructure. Again, digital rather than data in their sense, but looking at it in ways that serve and protect public interests and that empower communities is the work they're doing. When I look across these things, and then there's cities. So in the UK, we have various cities taking approaches. So three that always typically out. They are London, who most of their work is focused on use of data by government services and public data from London being brought together, shared for use by government in public services. We have Data Mill North, which is around Leeds and the Leeds area, so Yorkshire and Co. I was actually looking at them, they're actually just pivoting a little bit. They were focused on open data, they're shifting towards location-based data and the concept of a digital twin. It's not quite clear who would be in control of that digital twin, like a model of the city and the people who live there to predict things, actually what's happening there. And then Greater Manchester, who've got a increasingly large department within Greater Manchester Combined Authority working on data, and community groups coming up with a declaration, responsible intelligent data practice, trying to show what's going on in their space. So I want to just give a bit of a tour across some of the things I can see happening. Obviously, there's hundreds of little initiatives, some of which are picked up by those think tanks. When you look at them, you start to see some common themes. I have, because I am that kind of person, I distracted my all the other news about pandemics and elections by rereading lots of these documents over the weekend on that bill, and there's nowhere I can go in a pandemic. So most of these things are led by technologists. So it's people making decisions. The people who are making decisions are technologists. You know, they're naturally focusing on their area of expertise and the problems that matter to them. So both of these things you can find another document out today from the OECD, so from the Global Partnership on AI, which was here's how to do data governance for the benefit of AI. It's led by the problems that matter to them growing AI rather than necessarily the problems that matter to communities. The language itself of these documents is difficult, shall we say. It's often not understandable by citizens. And I'm not seeing much thinking in these documents, with a few exceptions, like the Manchester one's a very nice exception, and some of the Asia work. Think about the harms that these approaches could cause, the harms they could cause to other people, things they may or may not do. You can see that there's a lot of, working on my meme game, a lot of expectations for what can be achieved through data alone. So lots of this work, you can see people, some of those initiatives, someone's either looking at saying we can tackle climate change, but their only tool they're using is data, or the only tool some things are using is open data, or the only governance approach they're using is a trust or a commons or a data sharing contract. There's not that much thought about other tools that could be used and how these data could be blended in with other things like tackle problems. There's a very high expectation there. Actually, for those who didn't see it, I don't know if people on the call know one called Cassie Robinson. She started a Twitter thread yesterday, which fascinated me, where she said her thing was that the answer is data, what's the question? And there were about 40 responses, all of which were different, showing how many conversations have all been thrown into this space called data at the moment, about really being unpicked. Lots of these initiatives were about taking control to the centre. So they were all getting larger and larger. So some of the initiatives at the UK government and some of the initiatives at the EU, incredibly large scale. And we think that's bringing control to the centre and also then giving control to the technologists who are making decisions at the centre. I mean, it's a very large power shift, which has really been debated, discussed, or changed. I know myself, I used to get uncomfortable, I suppose, in some of those things, and maybe should have spoken out more. Yes, we just have a beer. And CyberSyn wasn't necessarily about taking away control, but I love the chairs, so I always put them to any presentation because I want one of those chairs. Very, very much. Very fuzzy, lots of these things, very large boundaries. So it was almost felt like, and I apologize for putting up a Donald Trump picture on today of all days if it triggers anyone, but it's best sometimes to face up to the events that are happening in our lives. So lots of these things were very unclearly defined around their boundaries. They seem to be trying to extend their boundaries towards what their masters wanted to achieve, rather than what was achievable, or what could be achievable while being well governed. They didn't seem to be balancing about whether the boundary was a useful boundary. Was it clearly defined enough what it was doing? And there was a lot more talk than action. So I know myself, when at the ODI, I got the team to do some work looking at novel data governance initiatives that we see, and Mozilla have done the same, and Ada Lovelace have done the same. And a common theme from all three of those initiatives was most of the things that people looked at were slightly imaginary. People were puffing themselves up, often to get funding and interventions, but there wasn't as much action there as it actually looked like. And again, various of those think tanks, there's not much action happening in the think tanks. There's lots of reports. There's not as much work actually happening on the ground. You struggle to find working examples of a data trust which is using trust law. And yet in my world, data trusts have been talked about for a while. I struggle to find someone using clearly commons principles to govern data. So I can see people assessing them against commons principles, but I can't see them actually being used in practice. So there's a lot of talk, a lot more talk than action, which I think is something we're all guilty of. I think myself, when at the ODI, we actually drew up our map of models as an explorer's map from the 19th century, deliberately based on one used by an explorer who made up his editors so we could get more money out of the Portuguese government, I think it was. And that was a deliberate provocation to try to keep it in people's minds. Say, let's be conscious of what we're doing. If people are using to put themselves up, let's be aware of it. What's happening. I suppose as I am just about sticking to my 50-minute timeline, so just getting closer to handing over to. So when you look at kind of what we need, and I'm just going to go into a lot more detail for me on some of these things. Yeah, do change. So we do need that we need optimism to make change happen. One of my favourite articles I often go back to is by a guy called Alex Steffen. How optimism is a political choice. We need to be optimistic. We can build new things. We can change the way the world's working right now. It's often how we make it happen. To temper that with more realism, I think that I'm seeing around data, because we're being subsumed into some other narratives and other people who are using those narratives in some cases to make great financial gain or to cause harm towards groups of people. We need smaller activities. So this is Mogwai from the Gremlin. Needs very cute little characters. We need more contextual activities to working. So for those who love the first Gremlin film, just to be clear, by the way, I know this has been recorded. Gremlins 2 is a much better film because of the meta. But Gremlin 1 is set in small town America with a small Mogwai, people working with each other, try to tackle challenges. So towards more contextual activities, working with people, using not just data, but using it alongside the tools to start to shift things. Do that to work out governance, to work out how we govern data in along with governing these other resources in those spaces, how that works, and then start to evaluate those things so we can see what we're doing. Then when we evaluate them, see what things we can learn from and possibly scale, because we scale some things like Pikachu and he turns into a giant store-friendly thing. If we scale up, he turns into some quite scary animals. So we also need to occasionally be wary of scaling up the wrong things, because we might find ourselves in a horror movie rather than a nice, happy Pokemon. And now I'm going to pass over to Anik. I hope that was interesting.
That's brilliant, Peter. Thank you. Anik, are you ready to go?
Yes. Yes. Let me see if I. Okay. So. Okay. This is not going as well as expected because I thought, can I share my screen instead of uploading a presentation?
You should be able to.
Okay. Hang on. I now lost my. Okay. Maybe Peter needs to stop sharing? Is that possible?
Reload the page.
I can only upload the presentation, but that implies. I mean, I'm equally happy to do this without a slideshow, but Graham, do you have any idea what button I should be clicking that I'm not clicking, because I'm not actually familiar with the software?
Okay, so you should have an option to the right of your webcam button, which shares your webcam. There should be a button to the right of it to let you share a screen.
Yes.
Yes?
Yes, it is. Oh, wait a minute. Yeah, now it's working. Before it just asked me to upload something. There we go.
Yeah?
It now should be.
Oh, yeah.
There we go.
Fantastic.
Peter out. Let me click on present. There we go. All right. Can everyone see my screen?
Perfect.
Okay.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you. Sorry for that. I feel it doesn't happen. It on that it's the 4th of November and I haven't had any sleep. Thank you for having me. And thank you, Peter. I think that was a really great overview, and it's great for me because it allows me to step out a little bit and consider sort of some of the narratives that are present within the fields of data governance and how some of those can be a little problematic. First of all, hi, I'm Anouk. I am a fellow with the Mozilla Foundation, and so I was involved in Mozilla's efforts to create a data futures lab, and I will continue to be involved as a fellow. That being said, I'm not currently speaking for Mozilla, so these are just my opinions. But yeah, let's get started. So yeah, what I want to do here is have a critical look at some of the prevailing narratives that I've seen show up in the data commons world. Because as a fellow for the Mozilla Foundation, I've done a lot of work talking about data commons, because that is really what we're doing a lot. But also, yeah, being in the space, understanding the issues, understanding these topics, both from kind of a political level, but also how they show up within communities. And there are a couple of narratives that, even though like none of the things I'm going to say are super new, but they seem to be specifically sticky, and they hold some implications for how we approach data governance and specifically building data commons. And I want to start with a question, which is, if we could go back in time 15 years before all the massive amounts of data about us were collected, what would we do differently? And I sat with this question for a minute, and my prediction would be that we do some things differently. We would maybe build interoperability into then the platforms we create, so that you can tweet your Facebook friends or send an email from Facebook. Basically, you can communicate with your friends regardless of what platform you are on. So that seems like an obvious thing would tackle. We would probably have data protection rights far earlier. We would maybe build in some ways to ensure that the monopolies we are faced with today and the enormous amounts of power we're faced with today wouldn't build up in exactly the same way. But also, I think there are a lot of things that would continue to be the same. I think a lot of the harms that we're seeing today, we would sort of reproduce. And I think the reason we would reproduce them is because there are some things we believe in, whether consciously or unconsciously or subconsciously, that kind of define how we look at the world. They define how we find solutions to problems, and they define how we even see the problems. And one of the first I wanted to discuss is really one that has been discussed many times before, but it's what I call like looking at the machine as some sort of magical machine. And this is a very sticky one. I see this as the fetishization of both data as well as the predictive algorithms that we're building on top of our data. In the words of Alexander Campolo and Kate Crawford, who recently published a paper about this, they call this phenomenon enchanted determinism. It's enchanted because we ascribe sort of magical capabilities to machines and deep learning technologies that we fundamentally don't really understand. We know that they create predictions, but we often don't fully know where these predictions come from, like how they are created. And when I say we, I mean including the designers of these systems often. Yeah, at the same time, it's deterministic because we still sort of continue to believe that these machines can predict us. They can predict our emotions. They have an understanding of our social lives, of our wants and of our needs. And this kind of faith in the machine, this tech utopianism, or it's also being called tech solutionism, and it's being called tech as a religion by David Noble. But yeah, so this thing that has been described over and over, it kind of just keeps showing up. And what I find problematic is that it's not just the large consultants who earn lots and lots of money selling data-driven solutions, and it's not just the Facebooks and the Googles of the world who earn a lot of money having their advertisers believe that they're very good at targeting people. It's also the critics of these systems. And I recently had this experience again when I was watching The Social Dilemma. And don't worry, a lot has been said about The Social Dilemma, and I really don't want to go into that too deeply. But what struck me is that in it, the recommendation algorithms and the targeting algorithms that Facebook uses are quite literally compared to magic. And instead of challenging the notion that maybe they're not as good as we think they are, maybe they're not even that good as predicting, there's still this kind of starry-eyed belief that these machines are incredibly powerful and good at predicting us, except that where the proponents of the system sell this as a great thing, the critics sell this as like something to be incredibly fearful of. And my problem with it is not like occasionally we'll be good at predicting, occasionally we'll be bad at predicting. But what we're looking at is the ability to predict itself. So we're looking at the machine as like instead of looking at the consequences of the thing we implement, we look at improving the predictions themselves. But the consequences are very, very real. And again, I'm not saying a lot of new things here, but some of the consequences of using data and using deep learning techniques and using algorithms to make what we call machine-driven decisions have many real-life consequences, like increasingly forcing humans to be more machine-like. I have this feeling every time I check out in an automatic checkout in the supermarket, where if I don't put my produce in the basket in the right way, the machine will start yelling at me, kind of, yeah, inducing me to be more predictable, basically. There's lots of instances, of very well documented instances of social exclusion, where we exclude the people whose faces we cannot recognize, whose behaviors we cannot predict in a way that they can kind of collaborate with the system. And often these are minorities, often these are people in marginal groups whose data hasn't been collected as much, or that the algorithms haven't been trained on. And then also we create a lot of self-fulfilling prophecies, and it's a little bit like astrology. Like, I have no faith in astrology predicting the future, except if I were to read my horoscope every day and I were to believe that whatever the horoscope says is true, then the likelihood of it becoming true is increased, right? So we kind of perpetuate we kind of create the predictions on our own. And yeah, again, the problem I have with holding on to this narrative is that we end up throwing good money after bad. We end up, instead of saying, hey, do we want to be making decisions in this way? Do we want to be using machines to supposedly predict our behavior, whether they work or not, do we want them at all? Instead of asking that question, we're asking, oh, how can we improve the data? How can we the machines so they make slightly better decisions and slightly better predictions? So yeah, for me, that's one very big one. The second one is, I think, is quite is the notion of personal data, an individual alone. And as a consequence of this invention of personal data, the notion that it should therefore be the individual making decisions about, quote unquote, their data. And I think I'm hopeful in a way that this current pandemic has shown us all that we are ultimately social animals, that my behavior as an individual, my choices as an individual end up impacting large groups of people, whether that's visible to me or not. So decision to go out of the door and go to a pub in a lockdown can end up affecting lots of other people. And because we're such social animals, our data is likely to not just be about us, it's likely to be about other people. But more than that, we behave in similar ways. So even data just about me can be used to infer things about other people as well. And sometimes that's really quite literal and direct in like data, which just sharing information about me. And in those cases, we sort of are, I think we're more eager to accept that as a realistic thing. But it goes much further than that. Like I exist in relation to other people. So a lot of the data describes those people, those relationships, but also the data about me can be used to both benefit society or to harm society in ways that may not comprehend when I make decisions with my data. So all of this really just to say that the notion that we as individuals can make individual decisions about our data, thinking that there are no externalities, that it's really, it's kind of our responsibility to just protect ourselves. And then everyone does that, then the collective outcome will be a good one, is I think a bit misguided. On top of that, by just focusing on personal data, we sort of forget that also data about things, about objects, about trees, about nature, that data, sharing that openly and freely can equally be problematic. Like there's still power dynamics attached to that data as well. I personally entered the world of data through research into agricultural data, which is not about people, it's about cows and it's about farms. And what I found is that in the wrong hands, that data can be used to understand how much a farmer is producing, and then companies can use that to set prices, for instance. So it is sensitive data, and it should, and therefore we should have some idea of who is to make decisions about it, and not just share it freely in some sort of shared data space. Somewhat related to this notion is the singular focus on access to data and collection of data, rather than looking at the larger ecosystem. And what I mean by that is this idea that if we share data more freely or we make it accessible to groups who currently don't have access, we somehow, that alone will be enough to level the playing field. Whereas in reality, in order to make use of that data, in order to do anything meaningful with it, we need to have computing power, we need to have knowledge, and actually quite a lot of it as well. So to me, all initiatives to just open data and that don't really look further than that sound a bit like creating libraries, but only teaching half the population how to read, so that only half the population, even though everyone can walk into a library and open a book, it's only a part of the population that can actually make use of that knowledge. So yeah, those are sort of the narratives that I keep seeing pop up, and increasingly find problematic. And I think they have implications for the data governance models we end up building, even when we think we're being very, very radical and doing everything right. And so I listed a couple of the implications. And one is really, and I feel like I talk a lot about this point, but It's to not legitimize the very problematic uses of data by focusing on shiny data governance models. So if there's uses of data, if there's things that we're doing with data, for instance, building contract tracing apps, when really we should be spending our resources elsewhere, or for facial recognition that only recognizes some of the faces some of the times, for targeting people on platforms in ways that are not very effective, but also ultimately problematic and harmful. Like, we can build shiny, beautiful data commons around these things. We can have some notion of collective decision making around it. But if the end goal is very misguided, then all of that really just works to legitimize the misguided end goal rather than undermine it, which I think should be what we hope to do. Very much related to that point is the notion that we should start with the problem. And I think Peter touched on this as well. Like, data can be incredibly useful. It can be used for us to coordinate our actions. It can be data about our politicians can be used to hold them accountable. We use data in all sorts of contexts every day. Like, we literally cannot make a decision without data, even though maybe I'm not defining data as something that comes from the internet. So it is useful, but it's often, instead of being super useful in like massive contexts where we can have magical machines predict things based on the data in ways that we don't fully understand. Instead of that, actually, where it's often very useful is in a given context. And what makes it useful often is to also qualify the data and not just have it be a single data point, but understand in what context it was collected, which people it represent and which people it doesn't represent. And once we start by asking, like, what is the problem we want to solve, and first figuring out what the solution is to that problem, if there is a solution, or what a solution is towards solving the problem. And then only then start to add data as kind of part of that cocktail. I think it could be super useful. But when we see it as an end goal, when we see it as like this magical thing that will solve all our problems, we end up with some not so great solutions and not so great contact tracing apps. I think from the notion that maybe our data isn't as personal as we thought it would, and maybe it's more social, I think for me follows the notion that we should have collective agency over our data. And that can look many different ways. And this is obviously where the data commons comes in, right? Like, how can we collectively make decisions about our data? And that's very easy to say, and it's increasingly being said more, and I'm happy about that. But obviously there are a lot of problems to work out here. Like, who is this collective? Who has a voice within this collective? What is the purpose of in which the collective comes about? But then also, and this more policy question, how do we collectively, like, what legitimizes this collective? Like, just grouping a bunch of people together isn't yet enough to have like the kind of collective bargaining power to stand up to a Facebook. We need to have the tools and the controls to be able to do that. And for the moment, we have personal data rights, but there's a whole lot of data that we do not yet have rights over. Fourth and last, to my point about it's not just about data, it's about all the tools and all the capital needed to do something useful with that data. I think we need to also, in addition to looking at ways to democratize kind of control and benefit of data, we need to look at ways to democratize access to computing power, as well as access to the knowledge. And sometimes that means giving more people that knowledge, and sometimes it means stop using jargon to describe things so that more people can participate in the conversation as well. That was roughly what I wanted to say. Thank you so much, and I would be so happy to have conversations about this. Thank you.
That's brilliant.
Perfect.
Go on,
Go ahead,
Christine.
Graham.
Just wanted to say thank you. I thought that was really, really good. And see if anyone's got any questions. You put something in the chat, Christina. Should we kick off with that?
Sure. I do want to say I will thank both of you. I also encourage both of you to ask each other questions if you have that. And anybody who would like to chime in, if you don't want to turn on your microphone, which you're welcome to do, you can also put a question in the chat. We'll try to get as many of them touched on as we can. And so that I don't have to say it at the end, I'll just put the link to the Join the Digital Life Collective. If you found this useful and interesting and would like to come help us do more knowledge access people, we're $10 a month to join the collective. If you're not, I see some new names that I don't recognize in the chat. So thank you very much.
Yeah, I would be interested to hear about. Have you looked into the idea of Alex Pendland, who has this idea of credit unions that in the United States have about 120 million people? They could allow their members to store all their personal data in these data vaults hosted by the credit unions, and then form data cooperatives. And the idea would be not so much this sort of idea of data dividend where you sell your data and get the money, but you could like do these bundled offers where it could notice that, say, 10,000 people are buying dog food from Amazon. Why don't they join together and bargain the price down by collective sort of purchasing? And I would be interested to hear if you've been aware of these ideas and what do you think about these ideas?
Thanks, Leo.
Okay. Yeah.
Care to comment, Anik, Peter?
Just a quick comment. I do know about the credit unions, and I think it's a really good idea to look at existing structures. So existing communities, existing ways of organizing around common issues, and to use those structures to then also govern data makes a whole lot of sense to me. Yeah, I don't know the intricacies of the credit unions idea. My understanding was that credit unions actually already have a lot of data, so they can just get started right away instead of having to also create personal data stores. Well, although that could also, of course, be in addition to it. Obviously, given my problems with personal data, I think, yeah, I wonder what they, how they envision kind of this collective governance layer, and what kind of decisions would be made kind of through individual decision making, and which kinds of decisions would be made through more of whatever the collective decision making process is. So either through representatives or direct voting or how it would work. But I don't know.
Does that answer your question, Leo?
I thought maybe Peter had an idea.
Yeah, I was just going to, I suppose, just one extra thing, which is, so yeah, I completely agree with that idea of bulk buying. It's in effect people coming together to bulk buy purchases is a thing that some things already exist for, which is great. I suppose to some extent maybe supermarkets do that as well, and I bulk buy all of me and my community, but we get cheaper food. Supermarkets are working on our behalf and putting down the farmers that used to help. So I think those things work. I think one of the challenges I have around some of the design I hear around personal data unions is often they get over optimistic about what data they can collect. So sometimes they say they can collect all the personal data about me, which probably isn't true, because when I walk down the street using data protection language framing of data, I'm collecting personal data just by walking past somebody else's phone, just by my contact tracing app is active on my phone, so I'm creating some personal data about me depending on the app. I'm in front of a camera. And similarly, the data that I create is often about other people. But I hang out a lot with the group, my data group over in Helsinki. Every year I go down to their conference and I ask the groups there, how do I get my data out of the personal store on their phone, which stores their data? Because I've had an email exchange with them, and every year they say, go away, we might have an answer next year.
I had the exact same experience.
But I'm a conference 12.
Okay, anyone else on the call got any questions? No? Okay. Well, I'll have a quick one. I'm really interested in the governance issues around data. I mean, I think that it's challenging, clearly, because data itself is clearly very difficult to define. All those issues around boundaries and ownership, and whether it's personal or social, or it's really a difficult area. But I just wondered what your thoughts were about the idea of sort of cooperative ownership mechanisms that might lend themselves to this sort of collective decision making effectively. Whether you've done any work on that, either of you.
Yeah, no, I spend a lot of time on this, actually. This is most of my work. And I do think, so I think I'll start with putting the problem first. And then this is increasingly what I'm trying to do is, what is the problem we're trying to solve? What is the question we're trying to answer? And then find pre-existing communities around that problem, which often exist, not always, definitely not always. But you will find that when it comes to those social problems, like often these already exist in cooperative structures or common structures, or when it comes to labor, there are already labor unions. And when it comes to lots of people making decisions together, there's a lot of problems, right? Like it's not an easy thing to solve. And there's like weird power struggles. There's there's no such thing as one community where everyone has the same opinion or needs. And so whatever the decision is that the group makes is always going to favor some over others. So there's some struggle there. But ultimately, in my opinion, I think commons are really well positioned to figure some of those problems out. And then, to be clear, I'm really defining commons in the way Eleanor Ostrom did, and not just as some sort of public good. And cooperative ownership structures, to me, doesn't say, it tells you a whole lot about who's sharing in the benefit. It doesn't say everything you need to know about the governance structure itself. Like we have cooperatives with thousands of members that maybe vote once a year who they want to have on the board, but then actually the board takes most of the decisions, which can be fine for some things. And then there's cooperatives where everyone actively engages in everyday policy and like activities. So that's more of the kind of ownership model than the governance model.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. And certainly my own experience in that area is that small is beautiful in the sense that where you've got smaller groups of people, they're much better able to engage more effectively in those decision-making processes. So that lends itself to a decentralized approach where you have small groups, maybe only half a dozen people in a group, and they're operating in some sort of federalized network, so that you can get the benefits of scale but still have the advantages of that sort of human scale governance, so that people can engage effectively in deliberation and decision making. Does that work with that sort of approach? How could that work?
So I think that could work, and especially if you step away from the notion that data needs to be collected in like massive amounts in order to be useful. I think actually small collections of data are often tremendously valuable. It's just a different approach of like making decisions and using data for decision making. And then I do think that having smaller groups works because in order to set rules with groups of people, you don't need to agree exactly on the needs and the interests, but you do need to agree on some semblance of what fairness looks like. And so the bigger the group gets, the more incoherent this notion of fairness becomes.
Yeah,
I think
yeah.
Peter was trying to say something.
Has anyone on the call spent time with the cooperative digital team in Manchester?
Very limited amount, personally.
So I did some work on data ethics with the co-op digital team a couple of years ago. So they were, they're obviously they're based in Manchester Town, Federation House, in the Federation House bit of co-op rather than bit of co-op. It's kind of all sorts of hierarchies in the co-op I found. They were doing some interesting things around. So they were approaching it from that they're an existing cooperative, obviously very long standing. They've got supermarkets, funeral services all around the country, and they were busy. And they were saying, right, we are collecting data. How do we involve our members in decision making over how that data is used? So I suppose we're doing some of that thing you were thinking of there about the allowing the communities around their shops to make some decisions, some being made by their central members' councils, and they were exploring those things. I haven't been for the last year, so I know some of their digital slowed down with new leadership
Yeah.
at the cooperative, but it was good to see them again. They're using what, as Anouk says, their existing muscles, their existing capabilities, and then saying, okay, now how do we bring this potential new capability into that? How does that change what's going on, and what else can we do? It was really useful work.
That sounds really interesting. Yeah, that's great. Thanks for that. I appreciate. We're at the top of the hour. Our time's sort of notionally up. I don't know if anyone's got any other points they'd like to make or questions they'd like to ask. Christine, you put a comment in there.
Oh, wait.
Christina says, I'm looking at how to make tech unusable without embedding some of the messy people part.
That sounds fascinating. What are you doing, Christina?
I'll talk to you about that offline. I'm actually really curious on the context question. If there is this idea of a minimum context where data could be seen as naked or unusable, if it didn't have some kind of link to the smallness, link to the federated, so you couldn't make these giant data sets and have it stay coherent, if anybody's working on that.
I don't know if there's a minimum context. I don't think I'm gonna have a lot of interesting things to say here. So the only thing that comes to mind is a paper I read about research data research data for kind of experiments in the field, which has been collected a long time ago and is now increasingly being shared between different research departments. And what they realized is that when people collect data, there's a whole bunch of things they don't collect. So there's a lot of metadata about the data they don't collect. And especially over time, when those researchers are no longer around to ask questions to, the resulting data sets become increasing, or like time less unusable, because I have this sample that I took, and then I collected and I calculated the values as like 5 seconds after I took the sample. Or you could take the sample, take it back to your laboratory, and then get the value of the thing you're looking for there. And just that difference made a lot of the difference to, for instance, researchers in the future who are trying to compare between data sets. So that's the one example comes to mind, but I'm sure there are many others, and I'm sure there's people who have looked into this.
Thank you so much, both of you.
Yeah, thanks very much, Peter and Nick. I think that was, for me, that was a fascinating hour. I really enjoyed that. So yeah, thanks very much for your time and efforts, and struggling with the technology a bit as ever, but that's the way.
Sorry about that.
So we recorded the call, so we'll make that available in due course once it's all churned through. And thank you everyone else who joined the call. Really appreciate your involvement. We've got another one of these First Wednesday things coming up at the beginning of December, and that call is going to be focusing around the people that are running this video conferencing service that we've been using today. So do join us for that. We'll send out some information about that in the coming days. So thanks again, everyone, for your time.
Thank you.
Hopefully see you again. Bye-bye now. I'm going to end that call.